I am really happy to be here. Let me get this started. I am going to talk today about, I normally do talk about poverty, but today I'm going to talk about a broader lens and look at inequity and equity, and going to give you some just-in-time ideas for an old problem in a new context. I want to start today by sharing with you something a principal just said I had surveyed this principal, and this was her thoughts. Once the initial shock and stress of learning to teach an entirely new way diminished, the teachers jumped right in and got to work. They continued to grow stronger each day and more creative. I knew they were good, but I have a deeper appreciation for them. I have learned the value of what we do. I have learned that as busy as we still are, there are moments that allow us to slow down, reflect, and focus on what's important. I've learned we are stronger than we believe. I suspect there's a lot of principals out there who feel exactly the same way. They've grown in their appreciation of the teachers that they serve. And I just want to start out today by giving a shout out to all educators. They're engaged in creativity, creation, innovation, persevering, and you've never been more important to this country than you are right now. So let's dive into this subject of equity in this new normal. So in schooling BC, as I've come to call it, before COVID-19, there was a lot of inequity, and our schools have mirrored the inequity in society. There was inequity in the environments that we provided kids who live in poverty and kids of color disproportionately. There were inequities in the opportunities we provided those kids programmatically. And there were inequities in the quality of what we gave those kids in terms of, for example, teacher quality. So inequity is not a new problem. It's an old problem in a new context. Just recently, in a really great blog done by Marceline Dubose, I hope I'm saying that right, and Paul Gorski, they said in that blog a question that I think is so important moving forward in terms of this equity work. They said, let's recognize that when we talk about this crisis only in terms of newness, we fail to recognize its connection with generations of inequity. As a result, we limit the impact of our equity responses. And you can see their question up here. Just as Eric was talking about questions, this is a great question. What will we make of the new normal? Which is really the question that's going to guide the rest of the time that I have with you as I talk through this. So a little bit about where I'm coming from. As Mark talked about, I am the co-author of a few books. All of these things that you're seeing on the screen right now are published by ASCD. We have just had our second edition of Turning High Poverty Schools into High Performing Schools come out. In fact, this past month, it was the member book for ASCD. And the Disrupting Poverty book, came out in 2018. These two books look at education in two different ways. One is school-wide, what do we do with poverty? And the other one is in classrooms. And to tap into the knowledge base, we actually interviewed educators from across the country for both books. What I'm going to do today is really, as I said, widen that lens, and we're going to look at equity not just through poverty, but in part through the practitioners that we have had access to, as Bill Parrott and I, my co-author, have done this research. Our second edition that's just coming out came out actually about 10 years after the first edition. And so we've had a decade of changes. One of the things we know about leaders in high poverty, high performing schools is that they take action in three broad arenas. They foster a healthy, safe, and supportive learning environment. They focus on learning, but not just student learning, professional learning, and the system, the school itself getting smarter about the way it does business, and they build internal capacity. That also results in collective efficacy. The reason that I'm actually connecting this work to what I'm going to talk about today is that at the core of what these leaders do is they level the playing field. They commit to equity to level the playing field. So what, about a month ago now, a few folks that Bill and I have worked with on a long-term basis. It's not unusual for us to go into a school or a school district and work on a long-term basis. Often these are places that want to become high performing. Often they are high poverty, have lots of kids that live in poverty, and just as often a lot of brown and black kids. And so these are places that beat the odds. They, despite the challenges that their children face, they outperform the state. They outperform their districts often.
Kathleen,
standardized tests. Yes?
Yeah, you need to share your screen. I'm sorry, your slides aren't coming up.
Oh, they aren't? Oh, no. Okay, I'm sorry. Wow. I've been talking for a long time. I'm sorry about that.
It's okay. Let's just see if we can get it functioning.
All right. Let's see.
I mean, if you haven't.
There we go.
Perfect.
Is that coming up?
Thanks.
Wow, sorry about that.
That's okay.
Okay, so some folks called us and said, hey, we are struggling with, a lot of equity related issues. We want to know, what are we going to do with grades? What should we do with assessment? We've got lots of kids who don't have access to technology. So we spent a good number of hours out in cyberspace looking at what were people doing, what were the experts saying in this context. But then we thought, let's circle back to these leaders in the high poverty, high performing schools who've had a lot of capacity, as I was showing here. Let me just show this. A lot of capacity in answering questions that about equity and about a lot of other things about serving kids who often come to school needing more. And so we circled back with them, sent out a survey, and also spent, as I said, many hours looking at how other systems, schools, educators, whole systems are sort of building the plane as they go. And I have 12 ideas I want to share with you today. And honestly, I wish now that I'd heard Eric that I would have listed these as questions. So as you see these, think about, how are you making safety and the well-being of students, families, faculty, and staff the first priority? So let me say again, these 12 things came from two sources: the leaders in these high-performing, high-poverty schools, and through our kind of check-in with experts in the field to get their sort of just-in-time take on what is it that schools and school districts should do. How should they think about equity in this environment? The one thing that we know absolutely is that a bright light has been shown on the inequities that are both in society and in schools. But schools are doing things about them, and particularly schools that had a lot going to begin with, we can learn from those schools. So 12 things I'm going to share with you. In the learning environment, every single principal we interviewed said that safety and the well-being of the people they serve, students, families, faculty, and staff, was their first priority. So that was their first consideration. Ensuring access, equitable access, or another way to think about that is equitable learning opportunities, access to those. It doesn't always mean that everybody has the same access to things, but how do we make the learning opportunities rich? So what we find here is that schools have done a ton of things in this area. Many schools have given hundreds of devices out to families. They have helped families or provided high-speed internet. They have outfitted buses with Wi-Fi as Wi-Fi hotspots. And those buses either go to neighborhoods or sometimes they stay in the school parking lot and people come to them. So there's a whole variety of ways that schools and school districts have provided technology. But then even with all that effort, there are still places where these school districts are having to do low-tech options, paper packets, even to the point of doing teleeducation. So they're literally picking up landline phones and calling on landline phones and teaching through those means. Lots of different ways. Now, with all that work, the other thing that we know is that there's a fairly low participation rate across the country. There was one study done that it was a small study, but it was an initial study where they found that 47% of teenagers across the country, about 1,000 teenagers were contacted, had not yet participated in any of the learning opportunities their school was offering. So low participation is a problem. That said, in the high-performing, high-poverty schools that we studied, it is much less of a problem. Most of those school leaders said that they had 80 to 100% of their students participating in what they were offering. So how did that come to be? I'm having a little trouble with this. So here are some ideas. These are the things that they did to troubleshoot the low participation. I won't be able to talk about all these things, but let's talk about this one because it seems like this is sort of where people are right now. So first of all, they prioritized connection with families and kids over academics. It was just important to get in contact with them. And there were a ton of ways that they did that. Some schools had a protocol, or school districts had a very structured protocol, like the teacher was the first line of defense, but then a counselor, then maybe an AP, and then the principal, and they just kept at it. They wouldn't give up on kids. Many schools talked about using multiple means of connection, so texting, cell phones, landlines, even writing letters, porch visits, all kinds of ways. There was a really great podcast that I listened to on Reset, and they were interviewing a teacher in Appalachia, rural Appalachia, and she was saying she has a spreadsheet where she keeps track of the best way to contact her kids. Another way that they are troubleshooting low participation is that they're engaging the whole village. They're not just, as I indicated in the protocol, they're not just asking teachers to shoulder this. So they are engaging the principal, the vice principal, teachers' assistants, coaches, counselors, everyone is engaged in trying to connect with kids and families. The other thing that they're doing is a lot of them are making themselves small. When you make yourself small, it's more doable. What do I mean by small? They organized before they left, before they transitioned, but it would be probably possible to do it right now. They organized themselves in ways, for instance, they used homerooms. And so one teacher had one set of kids that she was responsible for. Other places used advisory that they had in place. One school district required a vulnerable student list for every school to come to the district office and to the superintendent. And it's expected that those vulnerable kids are checked on. There's a check-in with them weekly. One of the things that we need to think about, and this was something that was out there in cyberspace, was preparing teachers or whatever educators are making these connections with kids, preparing them for the anxiety that they are likely to encounter when they make these connections. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And the other thing to keep in mind that could be related to low participation is the idea that if you're requiring synchronous sessions, you may want to think about, or at least be sensitive to the fact that sometimes for some kids, just the background that we can be exposed to when we're asking kids to Zoom in. So they maybe have gotten a device, they have the internet, but it may not be comfortable for some kids to actually have you zooming into their lives. So that's something we need to be sensitive to. And the last idea that I just want to share is that people said a lot about focusing on leveraging relationships. So if they knew they had a family that was at risk, that they weren't able to contact, they leveraged a relationship that they knew somebody had a relationship with that family. It wasn't necessarily the teacher, it wasn't necessarily the counselor, but it was someone the family trusted. So equity in learning, what are schools doing as they build this plane, just like I'm sure that many of you feel like you're doing, to ensure equity in this arena of learning? They're rethinking grading practices. Many of these have done a hold harmless approach. So wherever those kids were at the end of third quarter, their grade won't go lower. Many times those kids have options to improve their grade. Some schools have gone to a pass-fail, but as Paul Gorski and Marcelina said in their blog that they wrote for ASCD, if we're failing kids in this environment, we've really got to think about our commitment to equity. So many factors kids don't have control over. Others are, really emphasize that they've really focused on assessment for and assessment as learning. They talked about meeting the diverse learning needs, and we'll talk more about that one, students' needs and diverse learning needs of adults, and something I'm calling pedagogical lemonade. They are making out of lemons pedagogical lemonade. Let's talk a little bit about addressing diverse learning needs. So again, the principles that we sought to get answers from to help all of you that are asking questions, and particularly those educators that had contacted us, we again had a hunch that if schools had a lot of things going before we went to what some people are calling emergency learning, what might they have to offer? Well, some of them said, we just moved right into it. We meet kids where they are and we differentiate. If you're not doing that, that is something to think about. One of the ways that they're meeting needs. Many people talked about small group instruction. Google Meets was one example of the way they were delivering that for kids who are in special education, kids who are getting English language learning services. They also talked about additional time, and that looked like office hours. Sometimes that looked like tutoring offered both in low-tech and high-tech ways. Low-tech meaning literally over the phone or via packets with an over-the-phone feedback loop. So, and then the third thing that I would say about additional time is a lot of people have their radar on summer school right now. What is it that they can do in those months? And it's likely to be virtual, but what are they going to do? Some schools talked about really focusing on universal learning design. So that's something to take a look at. And again, small makes monitoring student progress doable. So again, are there ways that you can make yourself small through advisories, through homerooms, through vulnerable student lists, those sorts of things? They have repurposed partnerships, often to provide tutors. And as one superintendent said, we've gotten smarter. We are really asking ourselves the question, what learning for what students, at what time, and why? Now let's talk a little bit about some silver linings. Many of the principals that we interviewed, as well as what we saw out there sort of in cyberspace, people are writing blogs and doing podcasts about some surprising silver linings in all of this. And these silver linings may in fact help us to reach a wider audience of kids. One of the things that they talked about were a sense of increased collaboration, of working together, and that there was actually more time working together in this environment than they had when they were in a brick and mortar situation. And the quality of what was happening, not maybe at the very beginning, but as they continue to work together, is getting better. It talked about peer support, and particularly of some teachers that they thought they were really worried about. And again, we're talking about equity for both kids and teachers. Peer support, teachers that they were worried about really stepping up to the plate to help others out, teachers who had expertise in online instruction, really helping each other out. They talked about these richer tasks where they were integrating SEL more than ever because of their sensitivity over the trauma and stress that both families and kids are likely to be undergoing right now. They talked about giving kids choice and helping them understand that there are some can-dos and some must-dos. Many people talked about doing things like project-based learning, place-based learning to sort of up the rigor, but also to make it slightly more family-friendly. And it wasn't uncommon to see people saying, let's do a project or let's do some place-based learning around the pandemic. One principal said, teaching and kids doing, they had to step away from that notion of teachers teach, kids do, to a notion of more, let's give kids experiences, let's give kids challenges, let's ask them what they did, and let's give them feedback. The other thing is there's lots of conversation about creating equity among teachers and ultimately for the benefit of kids by providing just-in-time PD. What are schools doing to build their capacity and to build their efficacy? So 3 more suggestions. They're engaging the whole village. And what I mean by that is, every adult in a school, it's not just the teachers, it's not just the specialists, it's not just the principal. They have, the kitchen staff involved, they have the teachers' assistants involved, they have the school secretary involved in a variety of ways. And that becomes a really important piece. They're also stepping back and asking themselves, what does it mean to engage families? And in this environment, engaging families, they have found mostly means supporting families in order to support their children. We'll say a little bit more about that in just a minute. And everywhere, there's an emphasis on self-care, on giving ourselves as educators grace, knowing we're going to make some mistakes, and having a work-life balance. So just a little, a few ideas about supporting families to support their children. Again, as I said, a lot of the issues around supporting families were around access. And in making this transition, we just saw how inequitable access to learning opportunities is. So in addition to the technology that I spoke about earlier, lots of schools were providing for basic needs. They were continuing to feed kids. They were strengthening partnerships that they had perhaps with the food bank or engaging in new food banks. Some of them were engaging in new partnerships with counseling agencies, with medical facilities. They were providing things like musical instruments and art supplies. They were centralizing some of their communication. If a parent has 5 kids in school, they were having to connect with at least 5 teachers. And if some of those kids were in the secondary, they might have to connect with 5 teachers within the secondary. So schools and districts were getting smart about centralizing some of that communication. I'll say more about that in a minute. One school talked about using a Google Doc as a directory, where the only thing a family had to do was get to that Google Doc, and then they could click on that Google Doc and get to a teacher that they wanted to have contact with. They were finding ways to have two-way communication, particularly at the district level. They talked about having spaces on their web page where parents could give feedback. One superintendent has a student advisory group that she meets with weekly, virtually, of course. Again, they were helping parents separate the must-do from the can-do. And they increasingly moved away from thick packets of worksheets to things that provided that could be done in the home, and emphasizing the rich learning environment that homes can be. And so simple things like take a walk, and if that means walking in your backyard, if that means walking around the block, and then write about it or video about it or do an audio cast about it, those sorts of things. The idea that teachers write lesson plans and parents follow them seems to have evolved for many of these schools and school districts, where there was a greater emphasis on let's just connect with families, let's find family-friendly activities they can do. Always, 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 reading to and reading with kids is going to be an educative experience. In the end, what we're doing now, Bill and I are working with schools and school districts to help them plan a new normal. And I will say, sort of basing this on Eric's wisdom, we have taken these 12 areas and created a planning tool. And the planning tool is really filled with questions for a school or a school district to ask themselves in terms of what do we need to be thinking about as we think about equity in this new normal. Really great report. You see the source at the bottom of the screen. What if we, pause, don't return to school as usual? By Hugh Vasquez. He is a senior associate of the National Equity Project. He said this: nothing changes without disturbance. Since it's people who change things, that means change can't happen until people are disturbed. It is in this place of discomfort where we expand our beliefs and innovations are born. When we are disturbed, we change. Probably, I don't know that I can think of certainly in our lifetimes, perhaps for the last century, maybe more, have we had a global disturbance like this pandemic. And the question really remains, what will we do with the new normal? What kind of a new normal will we build? Will we build on the silver linings and take the opportunity to once and for all double down on the inequities and create a more equitable system?